October 14th, 1945. An American military officer walks into a prison camp processing room and stops cold. 247 Japanese women, enemy prisoners of war, are standing in towels, dripping wet, refusing to move. Clean clothes are stacked on the tables in front of them. Hot food is waiting in the next room. The war has been over for 2 months, and they will not get dressed. The sergeant in charge has tried everything: translated orders, demonstrations, raised voice. Nothing works. The women just stand there, faces downcast, whispering 3 words to each other over and over. We are unclean. This is the moment that should never have happened. The moment that every military regulation, every wartime protocol, every logical calculation says should end with a simple order: get dressed or face consequences. But what happens next, the decision made by one American officer in the next 20 minutes, would quietly shatter everything 247 women had been taught to believe about their enemy. And it would do something that 4 years of brutal Pacific warfare, 2 atomic bombs, and the complete destruction of the Japanese Empire could not do alone. It would begin to change minds. If stories like this move you, moments where humanity breaks through even the worst of war, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. Join us as we explore the forgotten corners of history, the stories that textbooks skip, the moments that actually change the world. This is not a story about battles. It is not a story about bombs or body counts or grand military strategy. It is a story about hair, about shame, about what happens when an enemy chooses compassion at the exact moment no one expects it. And it begins not with generals or presidents, but with a 23-year-old typist named Akiko Tanaka, standing on a ship deck in San Francisco Bay, watching the Golden Gate Bridge emerge from the fog, trying to understand how she had survived a war that was supposed to kill her. By October 1945, the Pacific War had been over for exactly 60 days. Japan had surrendered on September 2nd. The occupation had begun. And scattered across the Pacific theater, thousands of Japanese prisoners of war were being processed, transported, cataloged, and returned, a logistical operation of staggering scale, involving hundreds of ships, dozens of camps, and millions of individual human decisions made by ordinary soldiers and officers, following regulations they barely understood. Camp Stoneman, California, was one of dozens of temporary holding facilities established to process Japanese prisoners before either repatriation or longer-term internment. It was not famous. It was not historically significant in any official record. It was a collection of olive green wooden barracks arranged in neat rows across a dusty field, surrounded by chain-link fencing and guard towers staffed by bored soldiers who had already survived the war and wanted desperately to go home. On October 14th, a transport vessel docked in San Francisco carrying 247 Japanese women, former military personnel, typists, nurses, communications officers, administrative staff, women who had served the Imperial Japanese military in the Philippines and been captured in the chaotic weeks following surrender. They ranged in age from 19 to 52. Some had university education. Some had never left their home prefecture before the war took them halfway across the Pacific. All of them had been told in careful and repeated military briefings, stretching back years, that American capture meant rape, torture, and death. That American soldiers were savages without honor. That surrender was the ultimate shame, and American captivity was worse than death. These were not rumors. These were official positions reinforced through military training, government broadcasts, and a wartime propaganda apparatus of extraordinary efficiency. Akiko Tanaka had believed every word. She was 23 years old, born in 1922 in a middle-class neighborhood of Tokyo. Her father had been a civil servant, her mother a schoolteacher who valued proper appearance above almost everything else. Akiko had been raised in a household where the floors were swept twice daily, where shoes were removed at the door without exception, where personal cleanliness was not a preference but a moral obligation. In traditional Japanese culture of that era, bathing was not merely hygiene. It was spiritual purification. An unclean body was a corrupted soul. Public dishevelment was not embarrassing. It was devastating. It meant you had lost your humanity. She had graduated from commercial school in 1940, learned to type at exceptional speed, 65 words per minute on a Japanese typewriter, a significant technical skill, and been recruited into the communications division of the Imperial Japanese Army in 1942, when the war's labor demands had finally overridden traditional restrictions on female military service. She was posted to Manila in early 1943 as a typist and communications clerk, processing encoded messages, maintaining administrative files supporting the operational machinery of an empire that was, though she did not fully understand it yet, already beginning to collapse. She had been in Manila when the Americans returned, had heard General MacArthur's forces advancing through the city's streets in the catastrophic urban battle of February 1945, a month of fighting that killed 100,000 Filipino civilians and reduced one of Asia's most beautiful cities to rubble. She had gone into hiding with other female military personnel, surviving on almost nothing for weeks before surrendering to American forces in late August, 2 weeks after the Emperor's radio address announced Japan's defeat. In the weeks between surrender and transport, she had eaten almost nothing. The chaos of occupation, the collapse of supply lines, the breakdown of every institutional structure that had previously guaranteed even minimal subsistence, all of it combined to reduce her and the other women to severe malnutrition. By the time they boarded the transport vessel to California, she had lost significant weight. Her skin was pale and dry, her eyes were shadowed, and her hair was catastrophic. 4 months without proper washing. 4 months of wartime filth of sleeping on floors and hiding in damaged buildings and surviving on scraps. 4 months in tropical humidity with no access to the medicated treatments that might have controlled what had begun to grow in her hair approximately 6 weeks into her ordeal. By October 1945, Akiko's hair, once glossy and carefully pinned, her mother's pride was matted in heavy clumps past her shoulders, gray-brown, with accumulated grease visibly crawling. She knew. She could feel them constantly every moment of every day and night, the sensation so familiar it had become background noise like a sound you stop hearing because it never stops. She had learned to tie her hair as tightly as possible, to never let it down in front of others, to carry the secret of her infestation, the way you carry a wound you cannot show silently constantly with a shame so deep it had become part of her identity. All 247 women carried the same secret to varying degrees, some worse, some slightly better, none clean. When the transport docked in San Francisco Bay and they descended the gangway into California air, smelling impossibly of fresh bread and diesel and something floral she couldn't identify, Akiko felt two things simultaneously. Relief so profound it was almost physical, and terror so complete it canceled out the relief entirely. She was alive. The Americans had not killed her on the ship. But now they were here in America, and whatever came next was completely outside anything she had been prepared for. The buses carried them through San Francisco, a city of impossible abundance, buildings standing whole streets full of cars, people walking with shopping bags as if nothing had happened, as if the world had not just spent 4 years destroying itself. A child on a bicycle waved at the bus windows. Several women looked away, unable to process the innocence of the gesture. At Camp Stoneman, female soldiers from the Women's Army Corps, the WWII, directed them through initial processing. Name, rank, duty, station, capture location. Questions translated efficiently. Akiko gave her answers, in a small voice, eyes on the floor. Then came the medical examination announcement. The delousing station, the clean clothes. And the moment Akiko felt her knees weaken, exposure. Not violence, not torture, exposure. That their secret would be seen. That American women, the enemy, the victors, would witness the full depth of their degradation. That they would see the insects. The women around Akiko had gone pale. Some were already crying quietly, the soft sound of it echoing off the processing room walls. What happened in the delousing station? The stripping away of months of accumulated horror under fluorescent lights. The small blonde nurse named Ruth Anderson, who met Akiko's eyes and smiled with something that looked impossibly like sympathy, is where the story should end. But it doesn't. Because clean skin does not solve matted hair. The showers improved things. They did not fix things. The lice were too deeply embedded, the tangles too severe. When the women emerged from the showers and were led to the room where clean clothes waited stacked on tables like offerings from a world that had survived intact, they stopped. Every one of them. 247 women in towels, wet hair, dripping on concrete floors, staring at gray military-issue shirts and pants, as if they were sacred objects they had no right to touch. The WAC sergeant in charge gestured for them to dress. No one moved. Then Mitsuko Yamada stepped forward, 41 years old, former nursing supervisor. Gray-streaked hair tangled and damp. The kind of woman who had believed in the Empire's mission with her whole body until it shattered around her son at Okinawa. She spoke first in halting English, then in Japanese for the translator. "We cannot. We are unclean. Our hair. It is not right to put clean clothes on unclean bodies," the sergeant tried to explain. "Just standard issue clothes. Nothing special. They needed to get dressed and move on." Mitsuko shook her head. Behind her, the murmur of 246 women in agreement. Akiko found herself nodding. Yes. This was right. How could they accept clean clothes when their hair remained infested? It would be wrong, even in defeat, even as prisoners. Some things could not be abandoned. The sergeant left. 20 minutes later, she returned with Captain Helen Morrison, 35 Medical Corps Senior, WAC officer. Morrison listened to the translator explain the situation without expression. Then she looked at the 247 women for a long moment. Enemy combatants, prisoners of a nation that had attacked without warning servants of a military that had tortured Allied POWs across the Pacific and made a calculation. She could follow standard procedure. Process them. Order them dressed or face consequences. The Geneva Convention required adequate food shelter and medical care. It said nothing about spending staff hours on enemy prisoners who refused clean clothes for reasons no American military regulation had anticipated. Morrison turned to her staff and gave orders no one expected. Bring all available medicated lice treatment. Set up 6 stations with scissors, combs, anti-parasitic powder. Call in off-duty nurses and WAC volunteers. We are treating these women's hair, all of them, today. The sergeant's jaw dropped. "Ma'am, that will take hours. I am aware. Make it happen." Within an hour, the delousing facility had been transformed. 6 chairs, 6 stations, volunteers appearing from across the camp, nurses, WAC clerks, even the wife of a colonel who had heard what was happening and simply showed up. A medical procedure that no regulation required for 247 women, whose country had just spent 4 years trying to kill American soldiers, launched by a single officer's decision that cost nothing except time and human effort. Akiko was directed to Station 3. Ruth Anderson was waiting, the same nurse who had smiled at her in the shower room. Blonde hair, pulled back freckles across her nose. Maybe 25 years old. The kind of face Akiko had been told did not exist on this side of the Pacific. The kind of face that seemed against all military logic and wartime propaganda, incapable of cruelty. Ruth gestured to the chair and began to work. She did not recoil. She did not show disgust. Her hands moved through the damaged hair with methodical gentleness, assessing planning, applying medicated solution, section by section. The smell was sharp and chemical and clean. Akiko sat rigid with shame that the American woman had to touch this, had to see, this had to witness how far she had fallen. She wanted to apologize. The words stuck in 2 languages simultaneously. Ruth hummed. A light American melody. Akiko did not recognize, cheerful and completely at odds with the grim task, filling the silence with something that was not judgment. Just sound. Just a person doing work and being present. When the treatment was done, and Ruth began to rinse warm water from a pitcher, careful not to splash Akiko's face, one hand supporting the weight of her head, and then cut 6 inches, falling in dark clumps to the floor, carrying with them months of accumulated horror, and then style. The short result with a clean comb, an unnecessary gesture, a thing no military order required, making it look presentable, even pretty. Akiko understood something that had no word in her vocabulary in either language. Around the room it was the same. Station 1, an older nurse working patiently through a 40-year-old woman's severely matted hair, murmuring encouragement across the language barrier. Station 4, a nurse letting a crying woman hold her hand, while another worked on the hair, understanding that sometimes human contact mattered more than efficiency. Station 5. Someone humming Sentimental Journey while trimming, filling the space with the year's most popular American song, as if this were simply an afternoon at a salon and not a prisoner processing facility, and not the aftermath of the most destructive war in human history. By the time the sun began to set, all 247 women had been treated. Morrison returned and asked if they were ready to accept the clean clothes. Mitsuko stepped forward. She did not bow. She dropped to her knees and pressed her forehead to the floor. And behind her, like a wave breaking, 246 women followed. The sound of knees hitting concrete came in succession. Wet hair spread across the floor. The only sound was quiet weeping. Akiko pressed her forehead against the cold ground and felt tears running sideways down her face. This was not the enemy she had been prepared for. This was something that shattered the entire architecture of everything she had been taught about honor, about strength, about who deserved compassion and who did not. Morrison's voice when she spoke was not the voice of a superior officer commanding subordinates. "Please stand up. You do not need to bow to us. Just accept the clothes and get some rest. You have been through enough." Akiko stood. She dressed slowly, feeling clean fabric against clean skin for the first time in 4 months. That night, lying in her bunk in the barracks, she ran her hands through her short, clean hair and could not sleep. Across the room, she could hear Mitsuko speaking quietly to a small circle of women, her voice low and intense. "Do not let their kindness fool you. This is strategy." Akiko stared at the ceiling and said nothing. But in her mind, a question was forming that would take years to fully answer a question about whether an enemy can be cruel and kind, simultaneously, whether a nation can burn cities and wash hair, whether the world was as simple as she had been told, or whether something far more complicated and far more human had just begun. The clean clothes were rough gray fabric that smelled of American soap. She pulled the thin blanket to her chin and thought of Ruth humming, and could not decide if she was grateful or terrified by what that humming had done to her certainty. She had come to America expecting monsters. What she found was going to cost her something she hadn't expected: to lose the comfort of a clear enemy. In Part 2. 3 weeks later, letters arrive from Japan. And every bite of food Akiko has eaten, every hot shower, every piece of bacon she didn't finish, because she was too full. All of it becomes ash in her mouth when she reads what her mother has survived. The guilt of plenty will crack these women open in ways that American kindness could not. And Mitsuko will reveal the wound beneath her anger: a son's name, a battle, a 20-year-old who died believing the Americans were demons. What happens when the enemy feeds you while your family starves? And can you hate someone who washed your hair? In Part 1, we met Akiko Tanaka, a 23-year-old Japanese typist captured in Manila, transported to Camp Stoneman, California, and brought to the edge of collapse, not by American cruelty, but by something she had not prepared for: kindness. Captain Helen Morrison ordered her staff to spend an entire afternoon treating the hair of 247 enemy prisoners. Nurse Ruth Anderson hummed while washing Akiko's hair, and 247 women pressed their foreheads to a concrete floor in gratitude. But now the real battle was beginning. Not the battle outside the wire. The battle inside these women's minds. 3 weeks into captivity, the letters from Japan arrived. And everything that American kindness had carefully built was about to be torn apart by 3 pages of thin, water-stained paper and a mother's careful handwriting describing what it meant to eat once a day if you were lucky. The camp mail distribution happened on a Tuesday evening in early November 1945. The administration distributed the letters during free time, thin envelopes battered from their journey across the Pacific, handwriting that many of these women had not seen in over a year. Some women cried before they even opened theirs, just holding the familiar script as proof that someone they loved was still alive. Akiko's hands shook as she tore the seal. Her mother's characters, careful and small, filled a single page front and back. Food was severely rationed. Her younger sister could no longer find work. They were living in a shelter made of salvaged corrugated metal and charred wood, sharing one room approximately 10 feet by 10 feet with 3 other families. They ate once a day when possible. Sometimes the Red Cross brought supplies. Mostly they survived on what could be traded or scavenged from the ruins. "Please know that we think of you always. If you can send word that you are well, it would ease this mother's heart." Akiko read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it and held it against her chest and sat completely still. That morning she had eaten scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter. At lunch, a ham sandwich with an apple she had not finished because she was not hungry enough to finish it. At dinner 2 hours ago, roast chicken with mashed potatoes and green beans and a piece of apple pie that she had pushed aside after 2 bites because the sweetness was too much. She had thrown away food. Her mother was eating once a day if she was lucky, and Akiko had thrown away food because she was too full. The guilt arrived, not gradually but all at once, like a physical blow to the sternum. It knocked the breath out of her and did not give it back. Around the barracks, the same scene was playing out in 246 variations. Women clutching letters. Women with their hands over their mouths. Women sitting on the edges of their bunks with expressions that had no name, not grief, exactly, not anger exactly, but something that combined both and added shame on top. The letters described hunger in specific detail. Families living in rubble. Children with distended bellies visible in the streets. An entire civilization reduced to salvage and survival, while these women slept in clean beds and ate 3 meals a day from tables where fruit appeared as if it were nothing special. The cognitive dissonance was not manageable. It was not the kind of thing you could reason your way around. You could not sit in a warm barracks with a full stomach and read about your mother scavenging for food and find a philosophical position that made both facts acceptable simultaneously. That night, Mitsuko gathered the women. Her voice was low, but it carried the weight of something that had been building for 3 weeks' pressure, finding its release through a crack in the floor. She did not shout. She did not need to. Do you see now? While we eat their food and sleep in their beds, our families starve. Our country lies in ruins. And why? She paused. Because they destroyed it. They dropped fire on Tokyo. They dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, women, children, the elderly. This food, these clothes, this so-called kindness, it is blood money. They are trying to buy our silence, our compliance. They want us to forget what they did to our people. Do not let them. Many women nodded. The letters had opened wounds that clean hair and hot meals could not close. The guilt of plenty had made them vulnerable in exactly the way Mitsuko's words required. Akiko said nothing that night. She lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the breathing of 30 women in various stages of sleeplessness, and she thought about Ruth Anderson, humming while washing her hair, and she thought about her mother, eating once a day in a shelter made of salvaged metal, and she tried to hold both of those facts in her mind at the same time without going insane. She could not make them fit together, but she could not make either of them disappear. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of her captivity. On the surface, the routine continued. The bell at 6, roll call, breakfast, work assignments. Akiko reported to the administration building each morning, typed files, and sorted mail under Corporal Margaret Chen's supervision. Drank coffee during breaks, listened to Maggie talk about her hometown in Ohio with photographs of white churches and tree-lined streets. "This is my family's church," Maggie said one afternoon. "Little place called Dayton. Before the war, we went every Sunday." Akiko studied the photograph. Everything in it looked untouched. Clean. Permanent. She pointed to herself. "Japan," she said. "Also beautiful. Before." She made the gesture 2 hands, then a spreading explosion outward. The universal language of destruction. Maggie's face went soft. "I'm sorry," she said. And Akiko could see she meant it. This Chinese-American woman from Ohio, who had every historical reason to feel nothing for Japanese suffering, was expressing genuine sympathy. The sincerity of it was almost harder to bear than indifference would have been. In the evenings, Mitsuko's circle grew. The letters from Japan kept arriving, each one carrying new weight, new evidence of devastation. A cousin lost to starvation in the winter of 1944. A neighborhood burned so completely that the landmarks used to navigate it for 30 years no longer existed. An uncle who had survived the firebombing of Tokyo, only to die of untreated infection 3 months later, because hospitals had nothing left to treat anything with. Each letter was ammunition. Each meal in the camp mess hall was evidence. Akiko ate and felt guilty and went back to her bunk and took out Ruth's photograph and looked at it in the dim light, and felt confused in a way that exhausted her more than any physical labor could. Then came the afternoon she found the document. It was a copy of the Geneva Convention protocols regarding prisoner of war treatment, left on a desk in the administration building, an English original, with sections translated into Japanese for camp administration reference. Akiko could not read all of it, but the translated sections were clear enough. Prisoners must be treated humanely, provided adequate food, shelter, and medical care, protected from violence and degradation, allowed to send and receive correspondence. She stared at it for a long time. The Americans were not being kind out of the goodness of their individual hearts, though she believed many of them had kind hearts. They were being kind because they followed rules. International rules written down, agreed to, and apparently taken seriously enough to translate into Japanese for the benefit of enemy prisoners, who had no way to enforce those rules and no leverage to demand anything. Rules that applied even to people from a nation that had attacked them without warning. Rules that constrained the behavior of the powerful toward the powerless. Rules that Morrison had not invented that afternoon in the processing room. She had simply followed them and then gone further than rules required, because something in her believed that rules were a floor and not a ceiling. Japan had signed the Geneva Convention. Japan had not ratified it. In practice, Japanese forces across the Pacific had treated Allied prisoners according to no rules at all. The stories were already emerging through translators and camp rumors. Things done in Japanese prisoner camps that had no military purpose and served no strategic function, only cruelty for cruelty's sake. Starvation, medical experiments, systematic brutality as policy. Akiko felt sick. She thought about Morrison's order that afternoon. Bring all available medicated treatment, set up stations, call in volunteers. We are treating these women's hair, all of them, today. Not because regulations required it, because Morrison had looked at 247 women and seen people who deserved to feel human and decided that the hour cost less than the alternative. She thought about Ruth's unnecessary gesture, styling the short hair after the medical necessity was finished, making it look presentable, making Akiko look like a person instead of a processing number. She wrote in her notebook that night. November 20th, 1945. I understand now why we lost. It was not just ships and planes. It was that they built a society where people matter, where rules protect even the weak, where compassion is not weakness, but strength. We were taught that such things were Western decadence. We were taught wrong about everything. She stared at the words. The weight of them was enormous, and also clarifying. The way a very cold morning is clarifying it, removes everything that isn't essential and leaves only what is real. The question was what to do with it. Mitsuko answered that question 3 days before the first transport departed at the gathering in the recreation room. Rice balls made with camp kitchen supplies passed around in a circle on the floor. The traditional formation. A taste of home made in an enemy camp. Mitsuko stood and spoke her warning silence. When you return home, protect your honor by never mentioning the kindness. If you tell them the Americans treated you well, they will think you were weak collaborators. Stay silent. And several women nodded, and Akiko sat with Maggie's comb in her hand and Ruth's photograph in her pocket, and felt something ignite inside her that she did not try to suppress. She stood. I will never forget the day they washed our hair. The room went silent. She spoke faster than the words coming from somewhere below, argument below strategy, from the place where things were simply true. Ruth had given her back her dignity when she had believed it was gone forever. That was not manipulation. That was not blood money. That was a human being choosing to see another human being at the exact moment when it would have been easiest and most acceptable to look away. Mitsuko cut back hard. You are doing their work for them. What about the civilians they burned? The children in Hiroshima. I am not saying they are innocent, Akiko said. I am saying the world is more complicated than we were taught. We were told Americans were monsters. They are not. We were told surrender meant death, or worse. It did not. We were told our cause was righteous. But look where that righteousness led us. The room flinched. To question the righteousness of Japan's cause even now, even in defeat, was dangerous ground. Mitsuko stepped closer, voice dropping to something almost dangerous. You sound like a collaborator, like someone who has forgotten her duty. The emperor renounced his divinity, Akiko said quietly. The war we fought, the beliefs we held, they were lies. And you know it. You felt it. When Captain Morrison decided to help us, when those nurses spent hours making us feel human again, you bowed to them, Mitsuko-san. You pressed your forehead to the floor. Was that collaboration? Or was that recognizing simple human decency? Silence. Mitsuko's hand lifted, slightly trembling. Then something broke behind her eyes, the hardness cracking open to reveal something raw and ancient, underneath grief, that had been compressed into anger for so long it had forgotten its original shape. She sat down heavily. When she spoke again, her voice was completely different. Tired. Old. Perhaps you are right, Akko. Perhaps I am afraid. The admission moved through the room like a current. My boy died at Okinawa, she said, 20 years old. He believed in the divine destiny of Japan. He believed the Americans were demons without honor. He died believing those things, thinking his death mattered. But if the Americans are not demons, if they can show kindness and compassion, then what did my son die for? Her voice broke on the last word. Nobody answered. There was no answer. Around the room, women were crying quietly, not for themselves, but for the question itself, for the gap between what had been promised and what had actually happened for 20-year-old boys who died with false certainties in their hearts. Akiko moved to sit beside Mitsuko. I do not know what your son died for. I do not know how to make sense of any of this. But staying silent, pretending Ruth did not exist, pretending Morrison did not help us, that would be another lie. Maybe the truth is that both things can be real. America destroyed Japan, and American women showed us kindness. War is terrible, and people even in war can still choose compassion. She paused. Maybe that is the lesson. That even in the worst circumstances, humanity can break through. That we are all capable of both cruelty and kindness. The question is which one we choose. The women sat in silence for a long time after that. No resolution. No consensus. Some agreed with Akiko. Some still held Mitsuko's position. But something had shifted. The question was no longer whether to acknowledge the American kindness, but how to carry it home into a country that was not yet ready to hear it. The next morning, the first transport departed. Akiko boarded the bus with a small bag containing her papers. Civilian clothes, Maggie's comb and mirror, and pins, Ruth's photograph, and her notebook. 3 weeks later, she would stand in Tokyo Bay and watch a devastated skyline emerge from winter fog, and the sight would crack her open in a way that nothing else had. Because she would have to hold the image of Ruth humming against the image of a city burned to its foundations, and understand that both were real, and that the world had never been simple, and that the truth she was carrying home was not comfortable, but was the only honest thing she had. In part 3, she finds her family, and she must decide, stay silent, as Mitsuko warned, or tell what actually happened. The Japan she returns to is not ready for her answer, and a conversation with her daughter 20 years later will reveal what this story was really about all along. In parts 1 and 2, we followed Akiko Tanaka from the moment American hands washed the shame from her hair, to the night she stood up in a prison camp recreation room and refused to stay silent. 247 Japanese women arrived expecting monsters. 1952. A quiet man who had survived the war as a factory worker in Osaka, far enough from the bombing routes to keep his neighborhood mostly intact. They built a life together that was not dramatic, but was solid and real. She had a daughter in 1954 and named her Yuki. Snow. A symbol of purity and new beginnings, the kind of name you give a child when you are trying to signal to the future that the past does not have to define everything. Akiko did not tell Yuki about California, not when Yuki was small, not when she entered school, not when she began to ask questions about the war that her history classes did not fully answer. The silence held for 14 years. Then one evening in 1960, Yuki sat across the kitchen table from her mother with the specific expression of a teenager who has decided to press past the usual deflections. She was 14 years old, dark-haired, serious, in the way that some children are serious, not somber, but genuinely engaged with the world as a place containing real things worth understanding. Mother. She said what actually happened, not what you tell other people. What actually happened to you. Akiko looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she got up and went to the bedroom and retrieved the box from under the bed. She set it on the kitchen table between them. Inside the diary, the photograph, the comb, the pins. I was a prisoner once, Akiko said, and the enemy showed me more kindness than I expected. They washed my hair, and then she told it, all of it, the shame of the matted hair. The 247 women standing in towels refusing clean clothes because they could not bear to dishonor them with their uncleanliness. Morrison's order that nobody expected. Ruth Anderson at Station 3 humming something light and American, while her hands worked through the damage with methodical gentleness. The unnecessary gesture of styling the short hair after the medical work was done, making it look presentable, making Akiko look like a person. Mitsuko's anger and grief. The letters from Japan that made every bite of food taste like ash. The night in the recreation room when Akiko stood up and said, I will never forget the day they washed our hair, and the room went silent. Mitsuko breaking apart to reveal the wound underneath a son named at Okinawa, 20 years old, dead with false certainties in his heart. The Geneva Convention document left on a desk in the administration building, the sections translated into Japanese. The realization that the Americans were not being kind out of individual goodness alone, but out of a system that had decided rules mattered, even when applied to people who hated you. Maggie's photographs of Dayton, Ohio. The comb wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, chosen with thought for a future Maggie would never see. Ruth's photograph with your friend Ruth, written on the back in careful block letters. The brief, unprofessional hug before departure, completely against regulations done anyway. Yuki listened without interrupting. She touched the photograph occasionally. She held the comb. When Akiko finished, her daughter sat quietly for a moment, the way she always did when she was thinking seriously rather than reacting. "What happened to Ruth?" she asked. "Did you ever see her again?" Akiko shook her head. "I never knew her last name. I don't know where she went after the war. But I think of her sometimes. I hope she lived well. She deserved to." "Why did they do it?" Yuki asked. "Why were they kind when they didn't have to be?" Akiko had asked herself this question 1,000 times over 15 years. She had turned it over in her mind during the mechanical work of rebuilding during the quiet evenings when Yuki was asleep, and the apartment was still during the daily ritual of drawing Maggie's comb through her hair, which had grown back to its former length, and was again, as her mother had always said, it should be her pride. "I think," Akiko said slowly, "it is because they believed that even enemies deserve basic humanity. That rules matter even when dealing with people who hate you. That kindness is not weakness." She paused, finding the words that had been forming for 15 years. "We were taught differently. We were taught that compassion was soft, that cruelty was strength, that only we understood true honor. But they showed us another kind. They showed us that real strength is having power and choosing mercy. That real honor is treating your enemy with dignity, even when you don't have to." Yuki's eyes were very still, and that way won the war. Akiko continued, "Not just because they had more ships and planes, because they built a society where people matter, where rules protect even the weak, where there is something more important than victory, how you win." She looked at the photograph on the table between them. The blonde nurse with freckles standing in front of the delousing station, squinting slightly against California sunlight, with "Your friend Ruth," written on the back in letters careful enough to be legible across language and ocean, and 15 years of silence. "I was silent for a long time," Akiko said. "I thought staying silent was protecting myself. Maybe it was. But it was also a kind of cowardice. Ruth existed. Morrison existed. Maggie existed. They chose something when they could have chosen otherwise. That deserves to be spoken out loud." "Are you telling me now?" Yuki asked. "I am telling you now." Yuki reached across the table and touched her mother's hand. The gesture was so simple, so ordinary. The universal language of one person recognizing another across a distance that words cannot always cross. Outside the apartment window, Tokyo was lit and busy. A rebuilt city 10 years past the worst of it, finding its way back to something that was not the same as what it had been before, but was real and alive and forward-facing. The rubble was largely gone. The buildings were new. Children played in streets that had once been ash fields. It was not enough to undo what had happened. Nothing would be enough for that. But it was something. It was the next thing. Akiko looked at her daughter's hand covering hers, and thought about a California morning in October 1945. A towel, a chair, warm water poured carefully. Akiko carried that knowledge onto a transport ship and across the Pacific, heading home to a country that was not ready to hear what she had learned. But what waited in Tokyo Bay would test everything. And what she would do with the truth, not in the prison camp, not on the ship, but 20 years later. Sitting across from her 14-year-old daughter in a rebuilt Tokyo apartment is the part of this story that most people never hear. The ship entered Tokyo Bay on a gray morning in late January 1946. The women lined the deck in silence. Nothing could have prepared them for what they saw. Akiko had known Tokyo was destroyed. The letters had told her. She had built the image in her mind from her mother's careful words, rubble shelters, scavenging once a day if lucky. She had carried that image across the Pacific and told herself she was ready. She was not ready. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Not damaged. Gone. Replaced by flat fields of ash and broken concrete stretching to the horizon like a landscape from a dream about the end of the world. The few buildings still standing were blackened husks, their windows empty, their walls scorched in patterns that told the story of which way the fire had moved on the night it came through. People moved through the ruins slowly, heads down, wrapped in whatever fabric they had been able to find. Children sat in rubble with the blank stillness of animals that have stopped expecting anything. Old people huddled under structures made of corrugated metal and torn canvas that were not houses. They were the memory of houses assembled from the pieces left over after the real ones had burned. Akiko gripped the railing. Her knuckles went white. America had done this. The same America that had spent an afternoon washing 247 women's hair. The same Ruth Anderson who had hummed while her fingers worked through the tangles. The same Captain Morrison who had said you have been through enough with the voice of someone who meant it. The same country that had built the Geneva Convention into its camp administration and translated it into Japanese for the benefit of prisoners. This country had also sent fire through Tokyo on the night of March 9, 1945, and killed somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 civilians in a single night. Had dropped a single bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th and erased 70,000 people before lunch. Had done it again 3 days later in Nagasaki. Both things were completely true. Akiko stood on the deck and tried to hold them simultaneously, and felt something inside her bend under the weight of it. She focused on the immediate. Her mother. Her sister. The next hour. The reunion happened in the shelter 10 feet by 10 feet of salvaged metal and charred wood, shared with 3 other families. Her mother embraced her, and Akiko could feel every bone in the older woman's body pressing through thin clothing. Her sister clung to her and wept. They were alive. In this new calculation that counted as victory. But the reunion was also awkward in the way that only guilt can make a reunion awkward. Her mother stepped back and looked at her with an expression that had no comfortable name. "You were fed," she said. Not an accusation. Not entirely neutral either. "Yes," Akiko said quietly. "They fed us." She did not explain. She showed them the comb Maggie had given her, and said only that an American woman had been kind. She unpacked her small amount of money and promised to find work. She said nothing about bacon or apple pie or hot showers or nurses who hummed. How could she? How do you tell a woman who has been eating once a day, scavenging through rubble, watching neighbors die of untreated infection, that the enemy fed you roast chicken with mashed potatoes and green beans, and sometimes dessert? So Akiko stayed silent about the details. And the silence became a habit. And the habit became the shape of her life for the next 20 years. The months after her return were brutal in the specific way that survival without purpose is brutal, mechanical, exhausting, without horizon. Japan was rebuilding, but rebuilding felt less like construction and more like archaeology, sifting through what remained to find anything still usable. Akiko found work as a clerk in a small business attempting resurrection from the ruins. Her typing speed, 65 words per minute, was still valuable. One of the few things the war had not destroyed. She spent most of her earnings on her mother and sister. It was never enough, but it was something. When people asked about her captivity, she gave careful, vague answers. Yes, I was captured. No, I was not mistreated. The Americans followed the rules of war. That was usually sufficient. People were too occupied with their own survival to press for more. Everyone had stories. Akiko's time in California was just one more thread in the enormous tapestry of wartime experience, unremarkable compared to what others had endured. But the experience shaped everything privately, invisibly, the way underground water shapes the rock above it, without anyone seeing the process. She kept Ruth's photograph in a small box under her bed. She kept her diary, adding to it occasionally when the present touched the past in unexpected ways. She used Maggie's comb every day, a small ritual, a daily act of remembrance, connecting her to the Americans who had shown her that enemies could be human, that people could choose compassion at the exact moment when choosing otherwise would have been easiest and most acceptable. As Japan recovered, American influence reshaped the country in ways that would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier. Democracy, women's rights, land reform, constitutional pacifism. The emperor reduced from divine to symbolic. Some people resented it. Others embraced it. Akiko neither resented nor embraced it. She simply recognized it as the logical consequence of what she had already understood in a California prison camp, that the Americans had built a system premised on the idea that rules mattered, that power should be constrained, that people, even enemy people, had rights that preceded and survived defeat. She married in filling the space with something that was not judgment, just presence. Just another human being choosing in a small way on an ordinary afternoon to see the person in front of her as exactly that. A person. The simple act of washing hair had become more than a medical procedure in the moment it happened, and it had never stopped becoming more. It had moved through 15 years of silence and survival and rebuilding, and arrived here at this kitchen table, passed from one generation to the next, like something worth keeping. Ruth Anderson never knew. She went home to wherever home was, carried her own memories of the war forward into her own ordinary life, and probably never learned that the Japanese typist from Station 3 had kept her photograph under her bed for 15 years, and thought of her during the ritual of combing her hair every morning. But she had done it anyway. The kindness had not required an audience to be real. It had not required acknowledgement to have consequences. It had moved forward on its own through 15 years, into a rebuilt city, into a kitchen table conversation, into a daughter's understanding of what honor actually looks like when it is stripped of propaganda and reduced to its simplest form. One person choosing to see another as human. At the exact moment when it would have been easiest to look away. That was the weapon that won the war. Not the biggest one, but the one that lasted. In 3 parts, we have followed Akiko Tanaka from a prison camp processing room in California to a kitchen table in rebuilt Tokyo. We watched 247 Japanese women refuse clean clothes out of shame, witnessed an American officer make a decision that no regulation required, and sat with a daughter learning for the first time what her mother had carried for 15 years in a box under the bed. But there is a final question. The one that matters most when any war story reaches its end. What does it mean? Not strategically, not militarily, but in the way that a single afternoon, a chair, warm water, a nurse humming an unfamiliar song can travel through decades and still be moving when it arrives. This is the part of the story that most people never reach. Because most people stop at the event itself, at the dramatic moment, at the image of 247 women pressing their foreheads to a concrete floor. They do not ask what happened to Ruth Anderson after the war. They do not ask what Akiko Tanaka's daughter did with what her mother told her. They do not ask whether the lesson outlasted the people who learned it. Those are the questions worth asking, and the answers are not what you would expect. Akiko Tanaka lived an ordinary life by every external measure. She worked as a clerk for 12 years, then as an office manager for a trading company that imported American goods. A fact she found neither ironic nor poetic, simply practical. She raised Yuki in a small apartment in a neighborhood that had been rubble in 1946, and was by 1960, fully rebuilt and almost prosperous. She cared for her mother until the older woman died in 1963 at the age of 71, never fully recovering her weight from the war years, but alive and present for 17 years beyond what the worst of it might have taken. She never returned to America. She never found Ruth Anderson's last name. She never knew whether Morrison received recognition for the decision she made on October 14, 1945, or whether it was simply absorbed into the vast undocumented machinery of military administration and forgotten. These things did not torment her. She had made her peace with incompleteness. The war had taught her that most things did not resolve cleanly, that most threads did not reconnect, that most kindnesses disappeared into the lives of the people who received them, without the giver ever knowing what became of the gift. She kept the box under her bed until she died in 1987, at the age of 65, from a stroke that came without warning on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Yuki found the box while going through her mother's belongings. The photograph was still there, slightly faded at the edges, now the blonde nurse squinting against California sunlight, your friend Ruth on the back in letters that had not blurred in 42 years. Yuki sat on the floor of her mother's bedroom for a long time holding it. She was 33 years old. She had become a high school history teacher, which was not an accident. She had spent 15 years teaching Japanese students about the Second World War with a precision and honesty that sometimes made administrators uncomfortable, not because she blamed or excused, but because she refused to simplify. She taught the firebombing of Tokyo alongside the Geneva Convention. She taught the atomic bombs alongside the occupation's land reforms. She taught her students that history was not a story about heroes and monsters, but about people making decisions, and that the quality of those decisions was not determined by which side you were on, but by what you believed people deserved. She had been teaching this for 15 years without fully knowing where it came from. Now, holding the photograph, she understood. She had it framed and put it on her desk at school. When students asked who the woman was, she told them. Every time. The full story compressed into whatever time she had. The shame, the refusal, the unexpected order. The afternoon that changed her mother's understanding of the world. She told it the way her mother had told it to her, without sentimentality, without the comfort of simple conclusions, with the full weight of contradiction intact. America destroyed Japan, and American women washed our hair. Both things were true. The question is, what you do with a truth that does not resolve into something comfortable. Mitsuko Yamada's story ended differently, and it ended quietly, which is perhaps appropriate for a woman who spent the last months of her captivity warning others not to let kindness penetrate their defenses. She returned to Japan in February 1946, 1 month after Akiko. She resumed nursing, working in a field hospital in the Tokyo suburbs that was overwhelmed with patients and understaffed and operating under conditions that would have been unacceptable before the war. She worked there for 11 years without complaint, treating wounds and illnesses with the skilled efficiency that had always defined her professional life. She never spoke publicly about California. She kept Mitsuko's warning silence protects honor. But something had shifted in her quietly without announcement. The women who had been in the camp with her noticed it. She was still direct, still formidable, still the woman who could shut down a conversation with a glance. But the specific anger, the hot focused anger of someone who cannot afford to let their certainties crack, had gone out of her. In 1958, she visited Okinawa, her son's grave. She stood there for 2 hours. When she returned to Tokyo, she told a colleague something she had never said to anyone. "I went to tell him about the American women who washed our hair. I think he would have wanted to know that even enemies can be kind." She did not elaborate further. The colleague did not ask her to. She died in 1971. She was 67. Her nursing colleagues held a small memorial. No one mentioned California. Captain Helen Morrison, the officer who gave the order that mattered most on October 14, 1945, returned to civilian life in 1946 and became a hospital administrator in Ohio. She raised 3 children. She was efficient and fair and occasionally difficult by all accounts, with an administrator's impatience for processes that produced worse outcomes than the alternatives. She retired in 1978. She died in 1984. She never wrote about the afternoon at Camp Stoneman. It is possible she did not consider it significant. It is possible that from her side of the decision, it had simply been the right thing to do, self-evident, uncomplicated, barely worth recording. You have power. People are suffering unnecessarily. The cost of helping is low. You help. That is not heroism. That is just the minimum that decency requires. But that is precisely why it matters. Because the most important kindnesses are usually not the ones people perform while thinking this will change everything. They are the ones performed because it is simply what you do when you see a person who needs something you can provide. Ruth Anderson. Nurse. Ruth Anderson. Station 3. Camp Stoneman. October 1945. Blonde hair, freckles, perhaps 25 years old. A habit of humming while she worked is the figure this story cannot close properly. Her last name was Anderson. That is all Akiko ever had. There were thousands of Ruth Andersons in mid-century America. She could have gone anywhere, become anything. She carried the afternoon in her memory for years, or she forgot it within months, absorbed into the accumulated weight of wartime experience that everyone who served eventually had to find somewhere to put. What is certain is that she did not know what the afternoon had done. She did not know that the Japanese typist from Station 3 kept her photograph under a bed in Tokyo for 42 years. She did not know that the photograph ended up on a high school history teacher's desk in 1987, where it sat for another 28 years, prompting conversations with hundreds of students about what honor actually looks like, stripped of propaganda. She did not know that the story traveled forward through time in exactly the way kindness usually travels quietly, without the giver's knowledge arriving in places and moments the giver never imagined and would never see. This is the final thing the story of the 247 women teaches. And it is the thing that is hardest to hold, because it offers no clean resolution, no triumphant ending, no moment where all threads reconnect in a satisfying pattern. Kindness is not strategic. It does not calculate outcomes. It does not ask whether the recipient deserves it by the standards of war, or nationality, or history. It does not wait to act until it can be certain the action will be remembered and correctly interpreted and passed forward through generations in the right direction. It acts because a person is present and suffering, and something can be done. Morrison did not know that her order would matter for 80 years. Ruth did not know that her humming would become the detail a woman in Tokyo remembered most precisely across 4 decades. Maggie Chen did not know that a comb wrapped in brown paper and tied with string would become a daily ritual connecting one woman to the possibility that enemies could be human. They acted without the knowledge that their actions would matter beyond the afternoon. That is not a small thing. That is the entire thing. Because most of us, in most circumstances, do not act generously when we cannot see the result. We weigh the cost against the uncertain benefit, and we wait for more information, and we tell ourselves that the right moment will come later when the stakes are clearer. The people in this story did not wait for clearer stakes. Morrison had 247 enemy prisoners and a staff with other duties, and no regulation requiring what she ordered. She ordered it anyway. Ruth had a difficult task involving a stranger from a country that had been trying to kill Americans for 4 years. She brought gentleness to it anyway. Maggie had a coworker she would never see again across an ocean that separated their entire histories. She thought about that coworker's future and bought a comb anyway. These are not extraordinary people in the historical sense. They left no monuments. Most of them left no records. The afternoon at Camp Stoneman on October 14, 1945, appears in no official military history because nothing strategically significant occurred there. A mid-ranking officer made an administrative decision about prisoner processing. Some nurses treated hair. Some women received clean clothes and went to eat dinner and eventually went home. That is the whole event. That is all it was. And 42 years later, a woman in Tokyo kept the photograph of a nurse she never saw again in a box under her bed because the afternoon that photograph represented had become the most important thing she understood about what the war had actually meant. Not the bombs, not the rubble, not the hunger or the shame or the collapse of everything she had been taught was permanent and true. The humming. The warm water poured carefully from a pitcher. The unnecessary gesture of making the short hair look presentable. The word friend written in block letters on the back of a small photograph extended across every division of nation and war and history to a young woman who had arrived expecting monsters and found instead a person choosing in a small way on an ordinary afternoon to see her as exactly the same. Wars are decided by weapons and logistics and the movements of enormous forces across geography. But wars are understood, their meaning, extracted, their lessons transmitted forward, their humanity preserved or lost in moments like this one. In individual decisions made by people with no particular power and no awareness that they are doing anything more significant than the task directly in front of them. Akiko Tanaka, 23 years old, former typist, prisoner of war, arrived in California in October 1945, certain that her enemy was a monster. She left in January 1946, carrying a photograph and a comb and a question she would spend the rest of her life trying to answer fully. She passed the question to her daughter. Her daughter passed it to hundreds of students. Those students carried it forward into lives that have not ended yet. Ruth Anderson hummed while she worked and never knew where the sound went. That is the power of a single human being choosing at the exact moment when it would have been easiest to choose otherwise to see the person in front of them as deserving of dignity. It does not require certainty that it will matter. It only requires the decision that it should.